start. Yes, I'm recording. And like I said, today we'll be going over chapters 8 through 13 of Joshua. So if you did all the reading, I hope if you had any questions, I hope you wrote them down, or if you have any comments, I hope you wrote them down. And remember, we'll be doing questions and answers at the end, okay? Just to give time to go through all the chapters, because there's a lot of chapters. And one of the things that we need to remember about the book of Joshua is that basically it's a telling of all the conquests and settlements of Israel in the promised land. Okay, Joshua is the one leading them into the promised land. And in the first few chapters, we read that they took over Jericho. And that was under the instructions of Yahweh, of the Lord, how to do that. Remember, they had to go with the ark, and they had to go with the shofarim, and they had to blow in certain times till the last day, the seventh day, they were able to, with all the shouting and the sound of the shofar, they were able to have the walls come down from Jericho. And we know that Rahab, who was the innkeeper of a certain place, a prostitution place, she was made covenant with the two spies, and so her family, her father's house, was completely spared. Okay, so let's go to chapter 8. Again, I'm going to cover specific verses, not everything, because especially the parts where they name all these names and cities and all that. So, but that has a purpose, and I'll let you know as we go through it, okay? So let's go to chapter 8, where it says, "The Lord said to Joshua, do not fear or be dismayed. Like, take all the people of war with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king just as you did to Jericho and its king. You shall take only its spoil and its cattle as plunder for yourself. Set an ambush for the city behind it." So again here, remember that Ai was the city where they went to attack without asking Yahweh about it. And not only that remember Achan was the guy that took some of the plunder that he was not supposed to take, and because of that, they were defeated. The people of Israel were defeated. So once they took care of Achan, remember that he committed Ma'al against the Lord, because he declared Herem, and he was Herem. He declared Herem, which means that it's dedicated to the Lord. Anything that the Lord says it has to be destroyed, it has to be destroyed. So it's called Herem. It's set aside, separated unto the Lord for his purpose, and his purpose is for that whatever he says has to be destroyed, and it has to be destroyed. But Achan took some of the plunder and therefore committed Ma'al, or he went against the word of the Lord, and so him and all his family had to pay for his error. And another thing is here, again, the Lord says, do not fear or be dismayed. You know, I'm with you. I'm not leaving you. So the same thing you did to Jericho, this is going to happen to the city of Ai. And not only that, he tells them the military strategy to use, which is an ambush. An ambush. He gives them the whole instructions on how to fight against the people of Ai. So in verse 3 of chapter 8, it says, "So Joshua rose with all the people of war to go up to Ai, and Joshua chose 30,000 men, valiant warriors, and sent them out at night." Another thing about us, as you were reading, I don't know if you noticed, that it's not, the story is not just about Joshua. It mentions the men that are valiant, and it mentions that all the people were with Joshua and doing what he had to do. And one of the things that the commentaries mention is that this story is about unity. It's the whole nation fighting against the pagan nations that are in the land. It's not just about Joshua. If you read stories about other heroes or other wars going on, they'll usually name just one person. Like, for example, Titus when he destroyed Jerusalem, Nero, but they don't mention all the other people that were with them, supporting them, helping them to win wars and have victory. But here it's mentioned not only Joshua and the people and the soldiers, but also Yahweh. Yahweh is kind of like the commanding chief, giving the orders on how to do and to proceed. So if you jump, please, can you jump, please, to verse 7 of chapter 8? And it says, "You shall rise from your ambush and take possession of the city, for Yahweh your God will deliver it into your hand. Then it will be, when you have seized the city, that you shall set the city on fire. You shall do it according to the word of Yahweh. See, I have commanded you." So the order was destruction by fire of the city of Ai. And in verse 12 of chapter 8, it says that Joshua took about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of the city. So out of those 30,000 men, Joshua separates 5,000 to do the ambush. In other words, they were going to go behind the city, while Joshua and the army, the people, the men that were with him, were going to go the other side. Because their strategy was that the men, if this is the city, the men that were going to, were in ambush, were behind the city, and Joshua was going to be coming through the front of the city to let them see them, the king and everybody there, and let them think, the people of Ai, let them think that they were going to, be afraid again. So they kind of go tease them, and then they start running back to where they were at. And so the people in Ai think, oh, they're chickens again. We're going to beat them and we just follow them and we'll destroy them. So eventually all the men, fighting men of Ai, when they see Joshua and his people running back to the mountains, all the men of Ai come out and leave the city without men. And so the city, behind the city, are the ones that are hiding. So when the ones in the city go after the ones that are outside, the ones that are behind the city go into the city, kill the people that are there, destroy and set in a fire. And so that's the way they did the strategy on how to get a hold of Ai. And remember that a lot of things about Joshua are very similar to Moses. Verse 15 of chapter 8, it says, "Joshua and all Israel pretended to be beaten before them and fled by the way of the wilderness. And all the people who were in the city were called together to pursue them, and they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city." Verse 17, "So not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who had not gone out after Israel, and they left the city unguarded and pursued Israel." Now, why do they mention Bethel? Just because most likely Ai, again, was like a fort, as Jericho was. And Bethel, the city of Bethel, was also in alliance with the people of Ai. Remember, they're all in community. So they're fighting together against Israel. Verse 18. "Then the Lord said to Joshua, stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand." And that reminded me of Moses when he, with his staff, like for example, he rose it against the Nile River and he rose it against the Red Sea. And the Lord did with that miracles. So he lifts up the javelin. Now, in the commentary, it says that the javelin is not what we know as the javelin, but they think it was a sort of weapon that looked more like a sickle. You know what a sickle is? Mm-hmm. That has a curved sword or edge or knife or whatever you call it. So it was more like a sickle. That's what he lifted up. And it says, "So Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand toward the city. The men in ambush rose quickly from their place, and when he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city and captured it, and they quickly set the city on fire. When the men of Ai turned back and looked, behold, the smoke of the city ascended to the sky, and they had no place to flee this way or that, for the people who had been fleeing to the wilderness turned against the pursuers. When Joshua and all of Israel saw that the men in ambush had captured the city, and that the smoke of the city ascended, they turned back and slew the men of Ai. The others came out from the city to encounter them, so that they were trapped in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that side. And they slew them until no one was left of those who survived or escaped. But they took alive the king of Ai and brought him to Joshua. So in verse 25 of chapter 18, it says, and all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000. All the people of Ai. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but when he uses the number 5,000, 30,000, 12,000, those numbers are significant. And I think I had told you that in terms of the temple, those numbers are important. Remember that numerology usually in the way most of Christianity looks at it with a different perspective than if you look at those numbers in the perspective of the temple. For example, the number 3 has to do with redemption, resurrection, sprout, restoration, new house, a new life, a new shoot. The number 5 has to do with rulership, with kingdom. That's why he used 5,000 men. That's why he, for the number 3, he used 30,000. And then the number 12 has to do with the tribes of Israel. So by killing 12,000 people, it's telling you they're the authority of Israel as a kingdom. So all those numbers are important. It's not just casual numbers, and most likely our numbers are being rounded up. They're not exactly, it could have been a little bit less, it could have been a little bit more. But the purpose is to show you in terms of symbols what those numbers mean. Going to verse 26 of chapter 8, it says, for Joshua did not withdraw his hand with which he stretched out the javelin until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. The word utterly destroyed in Hebrew is cherem. Cherim, because it's plural. Cherim. So cherim is utterly destruction as the Lord commanded. Now to us that might sound terrible, but when the Lord says something, you just have to do it. And it doesn't always have to make sense to us or logic. The important is obedience. And remember that the purpose of destroying these people of these nations, it was because of all the abominations these people were doing, these nations, that the Lord was fed up with them. Remember when he said he was bringing the people of Israel into this land, it wasn't because they were any better, but he said, I'm cleaning the land and I'm putting you in for my name's sake, not because of your righteousness, my righteousness and my name's sake. And if you're in covenant with me, you're going to do what the covenant says between us. So you are going to show forth my reputation, my righteousness. Okay, so that's why he had to kill, because if he left any of these people, they were going to be a snare unto the people of Israel. They were going to be contaminated. And it says, verse 27, Israel took only the cattle and the spoil of that city as plunder for themselves, according to the word of the Lord, which he had commanded Joshua. And why? Because remember, they're just going into the promised land right now. They're going through all these wars, and most likely they won't have time to sow and to harvest and to deal with taking care of animals. So this would serve them to keep them going. All these animals and all these things that they plundered, except the people. It says in verse 28, so Joshua burned Ai and made it a heap forever, a desolation until this day. Verse 29, he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. And at sunset, Joshua gave command, and they took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the city gate and raised over it a great heap of stones that stands to this day. Why did he hang him? Shame. Hanging an individual and not burying an individual is shame. So by hanging the king, everybody saw that, and that individual was considered shameful among the people of Israel. And why did he take him down from the tree at sunset? Because the word says you don't let them hanging in spite of. You don't let them hanging, you take them down. But he took him down and threw him at the gate, in front of the gate of the city. Still, it was a shameful act. Okay. But then in verses 30 forward, this is important. It says, Then Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, in Mount Ebal. Do you remember Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim? Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim were the mountains where the Lord said that once they got to the promised land, one was Gerizim, and the other one was Ebal. In Ebal, they were going to pronounce the curses, and in Gerizim, they were going to pronounce the blessings. So this is that place eventually was called Shechem, and today in Israel is called Nablus. Nablus is completely Palestinian this day. So, and these two mountains, and again, they're not huge mountains, they're small mounts, but it was a main entrance in towards Jerusalem and towards the promised land. So this was a main highway. So everybody that went there would see the altar, would see the stones with the Torah written on them, knowing that that meant that this is the threshold to the promised land of Yahweh. A threshold. Not only that, the blessings and the curses to show them the covenant that Yahweh had with his people Israel. And not only that, every person, any people that went through this highway would have to recognize the authority of Yahweh over this land. That's why they had to put up the stones with the covenant written on it. So it says, Then Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, in Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the sons of Israel. As it is written in the book of the Torah of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no man had wielded an iron tool. And they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. Why? First of all, because the Lord had commanded it. Number two, in gratitude that they were able to defeat the people from Ai, and also previously to that, the people from Jericho. So this is a memorial of putting those stones there with the covenant and showing the authority of Yahweh in the threshold to the promised land once they crossed over. And it says, He wrote there on the stones a copy of the Torah of Moses, which he had written in the presence of the sons of Israel. Joshua wrote it. Why? Because it was the leader, the king, that had to always write a copy of the covenant. Verse 33, all Israel was their elders and officers and their judges were standing on both sides of the ark before the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as the native. Half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim and the other half in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had given command at first to bless the people of Israel. Then afterward he read all the words of the Torah, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the Torah. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, with the women and the little ones and the strangers who were living among them. That word assembly is the word that has come into the Greek as church. So was the church in the wilderness? Was the church in the promised land? Was the church in the time of Joshua? Yes. It's the same word, assembly, Kehila, is the same thing as church. The translation in Greek is church, assembly. Okay. Now in chapter 9, we have an interesting case. We have a group of people called the Gibeonites. And the thing about the Gibeonites is they deceived Joshua and all the people of Israel by making believe that they were from a very far land and they wanted to know about Yahweh, the God of Israel. But the thing was that they had heard of all the things that Joshua had done against Jericho, against Ai, and against all the kings of that part of the land, and they were afraid. So the issue here is that everywhere that Israel moves, all the nations are afraid of them. Why? Because they have heard of all the things that Yahweh, the God of Israel, has done in favor of Israel. They have been able to defeat everybody, completely destroy these nations and these people. So chapter 9 says, now it came about when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan, in the hill country and in the lowland, and all the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, and all the ites heard of it, that they gathered themselves together with one accord to fight with Joshua and with Israel. They're so afraid of him, of the people of Israel, that all these nations, all these kings come together and let's say, let's beat them, let's destroy them, because if not, we're going to be destroyed. So basically, you have all these nations, all these kings against one leader in Israel, Joshua. Now, when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they also acted craftily. That word there is similar to the word used for when the snake deceived Eve. They also acted craftily and set out as envoys and took worn out sacks on their donkeys and wineskins worn out and torn and mended and worn out and patched sandals on their feet and worn out clothes on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and had become crumbled. They went to Joshua to the camp of Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, we have come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us. But the men of Israel said to them, which they call them Hivites, perhaps you are living within our land. How then shall we make a covenant with you? It's interesting that already Joshua says, perhaps you're living within our land. It's already their land. They know it's their land. Why? Because Yahweh said, this land is your land. That sounds like a song, I know.
It does. It does.
And so, verse 8, they said, but they said to Joshua, we are your servants. And it tells them, your servants, verse 9, your servants have come from a very far country because of the fame of Yahweh, your Elohim, for we have heard the report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, and to Og, king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go to meet them, and say to them, we are your servants. Now then, make a covenant with us. So they looked at them. They all look raggedy, and they look like they've been traveling forever and ever. And even the bread that they brought was already stale bread, to show them that, oh, even our provisions, everything is messed up. Oh, please, please, we've heard of Yahweh. We need to make this covenant with you. Why? Because they really didn't want to get killed by the Israelites. So, verse 14 of chapter 9, it says, so the men of Israel took some of their provisions and did not ask for counsel of the Lord. If there's one thing that I have learned, is to ask the Lord about everything. I mean, everything. I mean, everything.
Yep.
Because when you don't ask,
Yep.
and then you do it, it usually never works out. Not only that, sometimes he allows you to get that you want just to show you. Trust me, I've been there, done that. And so now I try to keep an ear really, 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 really keen to everything that he's saying. Because there's nothing worse to do something and not have his blessing. Ask Sarah with Ishmael and Hagar. Look at the problem till this day that we have. Okay? So verse 14, they did not ask the Lord. Verse 15, Joshua made peace with them. In other words, he made a covenant. And made a covenant with them to let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. Now remember that during this time when a covenant was made among two peoples, the peoples made the covenant in the name of their gods. Therefore, the people of Israel had to make the covenant in the name of Yahweh. And if this covenant was broken, you are saying that your God has a bad reputation. Your God is not honorable. Your God cannot be trusted. And it came about at the end of 3 days. Wow, 3 days. 3, the number 3. After they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were neighbors and that they were living within their land. So then the sons of Israel set out and came to their cities on the 3rd day. Verse 18, the sons of Israel did not strike them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. They had sworn the covenant in the name of Yahweh. If they came then and killed them, where they were showing not only the people of that place of the Gibeonites, but all, remember that news there, how, I don't know, runs pretty fast. So everybody else was going to find out, these Israelites, you can't trust them if they make a covenant with you. Their God cannot be trusted, it's dishonorable. The reputation of this God is not good. So it says that they couldn't kill them because they had sworn an oath to them in the name of Yahweh. And the whole congregation grumbled against the leaders. But all the leaders said to the whole congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we cannot touch them. This we will do to them, even let them live, so that wrath will not be upon us for the oath which we swore to them. Because if they had broken that covenant, that oath in the name of Yahweh, Yahweh had the legal right to go against Israel for breaking that covenant, because they were messing up his name. Verse 21, the leader said to them, let them live. So they became hewers of wood and drawers of water for the whole congregation, just as the leaders had spoken to them. Then Joshua called for them and spoke to them, saying, why have you deceived us, saying we are very far from you when you are living within our land? Now therefore, this is what Joshua says, you are cursed, and you shall never cease being slaves, both hewers of wood and drawers of water, for the house of my God. In other words, Joshua told these people, the Gibeonites, that they were going to be slaves forever, bringing wood and water to the people, and not only to the people, but to the temple. So to this, in other words, even though in Israel, the commandments show us that there's justice, righteousness, equality, and equity for everybody, these people remain slaves in a lower class. Up to a certain point, they were never given the same privileges as the rest of the people. Why? Because they deceived them, and they made a covenant based on a lie from these people. They used the name of Yahweh, and the covenant was a lie because these people were from right there. And verse 24, this is what they answered. It says, so they answered Joshua and said, because it was certainly told your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore we feared greatly for our lives because of you and have done this thing. Now behold, we are in your hands. Do as it seems good and right in your sight to do it to us. Thus he did to them and delivered them from the hands of the sons of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place which he would choose. So eventually, even to when they build the temple in Jerusalem, the generations of these people had to serve them, bringing water and bringing wood for the temple. Okay. So now in chapter 10 has an interesting story. It says, now it came about when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, Kedem, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, that he feared greatly. Why? Because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. So therefore, this king gets a hold of other kings for a total of 5 kings. They get together and they come against Israel, and also they come against Gibeon, because Gibeon made a treaty, a covenant with Israel. And according to them, Gibeon was an important city of many mighty warriors. So what are they thinking? Now the Gibeonites are united with Israel. Now they're going to be even more stronger. Verse 6. So they come against Gibeon, and because of the covenant with the Gibeonites, verse 6 says, Then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, saying, Do not abandon your servants. Come to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. The Lord said to Joshua, Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them shall stand before you. So Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. And the Lord confounded them before Israel, and he slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. So the issue is a power struggle. These kings against Israel and the Gibeonites. But the Lord keeps telling Joshua not to be afraid, because he has given them into his hand. Not only that, the Lord intervenes by confounding the armies of these kings. As a matter of fact, it says, if you continue reading on that verse, in verse 11, it says, As they fled from before Israel while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, the Lord threw large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. So they're seeing the same way that the Lord protected the people of Israel when they were coming from Egypt against Pharaoh. Remember that there's a point where Pharaoh is on one side and Israel's on the other, and there's darkness between them, and the Lord peeks out through the clouds and everybody gets spooked. Do you remember that? Yeah, when Israel, there's a point where they're right in between the waters and Pharaoh, and there's darkness, there's light on the side of Israel, and there's darkness on the side of Egypt. And in between the clouds, it says that the Lord peeked through the clouds and they saw him and they got all spooked. The Egyptians. Read that again. So the people he's doing that again for Israel. But this is the interesting part. It says in verse 12, Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Aijalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Isn't it not written in the book of Yashar? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. There was no day like that before it or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Now, there's many theories associated with that. And today I was reading a comment, which to me makes more sense than all the other stuff I have heard before. And remember, they're fighting against the Amorites. And all these cultures have their own beliefs and their own way of seeing things. And it so happens that if they saw any, according to the commentaries, this was a day where there was a full moon. And I don't know if you ever noticed that early in the morning, if there's a full moon, you can see the sun rising and see the moon at the same time. Okay, the moon is disappearing while the sun is rising, but you have them right opposite each other. So they're thinking this was during a full moon. And so at this point, they're early in the morning fighting against these kings. And so both the sun and the moon are at the same time. So instead of the sun continue to rise and the moon to disappear, it just stood. And according to the commentary, the Amorites believed that this not seeing that the moon and the sun continued to move but stayed there, was an omen, a celestial omen from the gods telling them that they were going to lose the battle, that the Amorites were going to lose the battle. So most likely Joshua understood their culture and understood that to the Amorites it would be an omen if something like that happened. So what does he do? He asks the Lord, hey, we need your help. Do you mind just holding these two things a little bit longer so we can show them that who is the God of Israel, who is the one that has control over the heavens and the earth, and who's in favor of us? That even me praying to you, you listen to me. You are a real God that listens. And so the Amorites, from that moment on, were seeing that their battle was lost all the way from the beginning. So that's the way they explained, that was that commentary. Another thing that I've heard is that when NASA was trying to build the rockets to send them to outer space, the first time that they did it over and over and over and couldn't get them to fly or do whatever they had to do, that someone said, maybe if we take into account that day that this guy Joshua stood the moon and the sun. I've heard this. I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard this. And they said, oh yeah, so by adding that calculation of that day, once they did that calculation, the first rocket was able to leave the atmosphere and go into outer space because they were missing that calculation of that day. So I'm just letting you know the way I was told, but it's possible that that happened. Okay, so basically what Joshua's asking is the Lord to do something so that the Amorites could understand that they were going to be defeated by the God of Israel. Now it also says in verse 16 of chapter 10. Now these 5 kings had fled and hidden themselves in the cave of Makeda. So remember, 5 kings against Israel. They first came to Gibeon, and the Israelites came to defend Gibeon, the Gibeonites, because they had made a covenant. So now they have killed all the soldiers, and now these kings, seeing that they're being destroyed because the sun and the moon has stood still, they ran and hid themselves in caves. So Joshua says, okay, put some huge stones in the entrance of the cave. Make sure these guys don't come out, but let's continue warring until we defeat everybody. So Joshua goes with all his men and defeats all the soldiers of all these 5 kings. And then he comes back and he says to bring these kings out of the cave. Verse 24 of chapter 10. When they brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings. So they came near and put their feet on their necks. Joshua then said to them, do not fear or be dismayed. Be strong and courageous. For thus the Lord will do to all your enemies with whom you fight. So afterward Joshua struck them and put them to death, and he hanged them on 5 trees. And they hung on the trees until evening. It came about at sunset that Joshua gave a command, and they took them down from the trees, and they threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves, and put large stones over the mouth of the cave to this very day. So he hung them. Again, a shameful act. If they were not buried, it was shameful. And that's what you did to your enemies. Remember also when the Philistines took Saul and Jonathan, they cut off their heads. They didn't bury them. Again, that was a shameful act. So they understood these things to be, that's the way the enemy treated their enemies. As a matter of fact, today, the enemy that's out there in the Middle East, and some are here in the States, they cut the heads off. That is a shameful act. They're telling you that your God is worthless. By cutting your head off, basically it's like cutting the head of the God in which you believe in.
Wow.
That's why they do what they do. So from that moment on, what does Joshua do? He takes all the cities of all these 5 kings, and the same thing is utterly destroyed. In verse 28, what did he do? He utterly destroyed it, and every person who was in it, he left no survivor. As you continue reading, chapter 10 is the same thing. He utterly destroyed and left no survivors of all the cities of these kings. Why? Because that's what the Lord told him to do. Verse 40 of chapter 10. Thus Joshua struck all the land, the hill country, and the Negev, and the lowland, and the slopes, and all their kings. He left no survivor, but he utterly destroyed all who breathed, Cherem, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea, even as far as Gaza, and all the country of Goshen, even as far as Gibeon. Now that Goshen is not the Goshen of Egypt. It's a different Goshen. Joshua captured all these kings and their lands at one time because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. So Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp of Gilgal. A lot of killing. I know it sounds terrible, but it's what the Lord asked. Again, because of the same reason, all the abominations these people were doing in these lands, and the Lord needed to clean out, make sure that no one was left that would contaminate his people, that would make them do the same abominations that they had done. Okay. Now, chapter 11 has to do with the king Jabin of Hazor. He also heard of all that Joshua had done, and so he also gets a hold of a whole bunch of other kings, and they come out against Israel. Verse 4 of chapter 11. They came out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. So all of these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. It seems like the same thing is happening still these days. All the enemies getting together to fight against Israel. Verse 6. Then the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So again, the Lord gives them the military strategy on how to deal with these people. And if you notice, they had chariots, which means that these kings, which were further north than the other ones, were rich. They were wealthier. Because they were wealthier, they were able to afford chariots. So again, the Lord tells them, don't be afraid, and this is how you're going to deal with them. Verse 7. So Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. The Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as Great Sidon and Misrephot Maim and the valley of Mizpeh to the east, and they struck them until no survivor was left to them. Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. And so he continues to do the fighting all the way. And I need you to go to verse 18 of chapter 11. It says, Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts to meet Israel in battle in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So here we hear again the thing about hardening their hearts, the same thing that happened to Pharaoh. And again, it's not that the Lord hardened their hearts, because when you read it in the Hebrew, what it lets you know is that their hearts were already hardened. And by doing this against Israel, they became even more hardened. And so basically the Lord is just letting them do what was in their heart. So that's what it means that he hardened their hearts. It's just letting them do what was in their heart against Israel. Why? Because the purpose was that Joshua would be able to defeat them all and take all this land of all these kings. And he was not supposed to have any mercy on them. Verse 21, it says, Then Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country. Now the Anakim is a group of people. They're not It's not a race of people, but a group ethnically. They are very tall. And according to the commentary, most of them were like 9 feet tall. That was their average height. So the Anakim lived in the hill country, and Joshua went against them. And it says, Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. There were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod some remain. Do you know who was from Gath?
Goliath.
Goliath. So he left these people. He didn't kill them. And we know what happens with Goliath and the Philistines later on. So basically, the Philistines were not slaughtered. Verse 23, so Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Thus the land had rest from war. So basically, he did a lot of warring. He killed a lot of people, but still there were places that he did not conquer. And they were left. So with whatever they had already conquered, he starts dividing the land. Because remember that Joshua is way up there in age when he's doing all these things. Remember, he's one of the 2 that were left along with Caleb that came out all the way from Egypt. Moses is already dead. And Moses was 120 years old. So Joshua is way up there in age. And he's been doing all this fighting and conquering all this land, but there was so much that he could do. So these other places were left, and unfortunately, one of them was the place from which Goliath came. Chapter 12. Now these are the kings of the land whom the sons of Israel defeated and whose land they possessed beyond the Jordan toward the sunrise. And you can read all those names tonight when you can't sleep. Or I might ask Jean. Jean?
No.
Verse 6, Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the sons of Israel defeated them. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave it to the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh as a possession. Verse 7, now these are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the sons of Israel defeated beyond the Jordan toward the west. And Joshua gave it to the tribes of Israel as a possession according to their divisions. And again, it mentions all these kings, all these places, and all these really easy names to pronounce.
Right.
Chapter 13. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years when the Lord said to him, you are old and advanced in years, and very much of the land remains to be possessed. Very much of the land still remains. Remember that they barely conquered 10% of everything they had to conquer. I mean, barely nothing. So what they took was barely, not even 10% of all the land that they were supposed to conquer. And it says in verse 3, towards the end, it says, the 5 lords of the Philistines. So these guys were left out. They were not defeated, the kings of the Philistines. In verse 6, chapter 13, it says, all the inhabitants of the hill country from Lebanon as far as Misrephot Maim, all the Sidonians, I will drive them out from before the sons of Israel, only allotted to Israel for an inheritance as I have commanded you. Now therefore apportion this land with an inheritance to the 9 tribes and the half-tribe of Manasseh. So the Lord is the one speaking and letting him know, okay, you've done so much, but this is who's left out. So, and 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 so. But once I give you this land will belong to all the tribes of Israel. Verse 8, with the other half-tribe, the Reubenites and the Gadites received their inheritance, which Moses gave them beyond the Jordan to the east, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave to them. And it mentions all the places that the Reubenites got. And all the Reubenites, the mentions of their places goes all the way to verse 23. Verse 24 mentions Moses also gave an inheritance to the tribe of Gad. And so mentions here all the places that Gad got. Again, you can read all this tonight when you can't sleep. Verse 29, Moses also gave an inheritance to the half-tribe of Manasseh. And it mentions all the places that the half-tribe of Manasseh got. And even though they mention half-tribe, they believed that it was a smaller portion than half of the tribe that got that side of the Jordan. Okay. Verse 32, these are the territories which Moses apportioned for inheritance in the plains of Moab, beyond the Jordan at Jericho to the east. But to the tribe of Levi, Moses did not give an inheritance. The Lord, the God of Israel, is their inheritance as he had promised to them. So basically, it mentions everything that Joshua had fought is on the other side of the Jordan. So he's old, and what he distributes is the part that's east to the Jordan, which belongs to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. So in the following chapters that we'll do next time, then all the other tribes are going to get their portion. And again, it'll be a faster the class because most of it is about names and places, and we're not going to go over them unless you want to practice. We can do that, how to say them. But it's just name and why it's important to mention all these things. First of all, it has to be written. It has to be documented. Because basically this is a legal document saying that it's like the deed of the land. Number two, it has to mention land because of inheritance. It's important to the people, the land as their inheritance, and not only their inheritance, is their inheritance forever. Doesn't matter what's going on today in Israel, that land belongs to Israel. It's a gift from the king, from Yahweh, and no one can take it away. That's why all the struggle and all the fuss going. If people just saw that the Bible is a legal document, and I've said this before, when Israel became a nation in 1948, if they had used this as their constitution, there will be no fuss today about what's going on about the land. The land is theirs. And if Joshua did not conquer not even 10% of the land, and right now they have probably less than 1% of the land, and they still want to take that away, it's because by taking away the land, you're taking away the covenant, and you're saying that the God of Israel does not exist. As long as God exists, the land of Israel will exist, and it belongs to the people of Israel. And the fight is going to be until Messiah Yeshua comes back and he puts everybody in their place. So I'm going to take some time now for questions and comments or